Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's launch event hosted by the University of Bath Institute for Policy Research. Thank you for joining us online this morning. My name is Nick Pearce and I'm the director of the IPR. Today we're delighted to launch a new report, Couples Navigating Work, Care and Universal Credit, the final report of a 3-year longitudinal qualitative research project funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. And as we all know, universal credit is a fundamental reform of working age means tested benefits, bringing together a number of benefits. And in the first stages of the rollout of universal credit, it principally involved single people, meaning that thus far we know much less about the experience of couples in universal credit, with or without dependent children. And this study, the findings of which we will now publish today, is the first independent research to focus on couples within this context of the universal credit rollout. Led by our colleagues Rita Griffiths, Marsha Wood, Jane Miller and the University of Oxford's Fran Bennett, it's been a significant piece of work and we're delighted to be able to share its key findings with you. I'm just going to say a little bit by way of introduction to the event. Joining us to discuss the findings is Rita Griffiths. Now, Rita is hot-footing it to join us, having given evidence this morning to the Work and Pension Select Committee on Universal Credit and Childcare. We're hoping she'll be able to join us soon. She's been with us at the Institute since 2016, an independent researcher for many years before that, done a lot of work with the Department of Work and Pensions. Whilst we're waiting for Rita, our colleague Marsha Wood will kick us off with the presentations. Marsha, a researcher at the Institute for Policy Research, also been conducting the research for this project. So Marsha will hold the fort, as it were, whilst Rita comes back from the Select Committee. Then we have Fran Bennett, Associate Fellow at the Department of Social Policy and Intervention at the University of Oxford, also an independent consultant and written extensively on social security for a number of different bodies, the UK Government, Child Poverty Action Group and many others. So we're delighted to have Fran with us today, who's also been involved in the research project with us. And then following their presentations, we're going to hear reflections from Ryan Shorthouse and Kate Summers. Ryan is the founder and chief executive of Bright Blue. He's a writer, a thinker, an entrepreneur. Many of his ideas have been taken up by the UK government in the last decade. And he and I are also fellow trustees on the Early Intervention Foundation. So really pleased to have him here today. And then Kate Summers, who's a British Academy postdoctoral fellow at the London School of Economics and Political Science, where she's developing new qualitative methods to study social security policy. And her research is concerned with the experiences and perceptions of poverty, economic inequality and related social policies. So great to have you with us as well, Kate. And Jane Miller, I also want to just to say, Jane, you can see in the screen there, Jane, hugely distinguished social policy researcher, as everybody knows, emeritus with the Institute for Policy Research now, been the principal investigator on this project. It's great to have Jane with us as well today. So welcome, Jane. I'm now going to hand over to Marsha, just in a little bit, I'll just do a little bit of housekeeping. Please note that if you're following this, your cameras and microphones will remain switched off. And if you've got a question, please submit it via the Q&A function. And then at the end of the session, we'll aggregate all those and we'll try to respond to as many as we can. So we'll have plenty of opportunity for debate. The session is being recorded, so filming and photography is taking place, and subject to any technical questions, we will make it online available as a podcast or video at a later date. And if you're on social media, please do tag us at University of Bath, Uni of Bath IPR. So that's probably enough for me. And I'm now going to hand over to Marsha to begin the presentation. And perhaps at some point we'll be joined by Rita as she comes back from the Select Committee. But to start with, I'll hand over to you, Marsha.
Okay, thank you. So I think Sophie's going to share the slides. Okay, great. Okay, so yeah, I'll kick off instead of Rita, and then I'm sure she'll appear at some point soon. So yeah, our study is about couples claiming universal credit, navigating work and care. And so I'm going to start off talking a bit about the research project and the findings. And then, as I said, Rita will come along too. And then Fran will give a reflection on the policy implications. Okay, so thank you, Sophie. So yes, as many of you will know, one of the key aims of universal credit is to encourage and support employment through financial incentives and other supports. So in our research, our key aim was exploring, as Nick mentioned, specifically how couples claiming universal credit with without children, both in and out of work, how they make decisions about household, money, work and care. And we're interested in focusing on couples in particular because of the kind of slightly different way that they can experience universal credits with the single payments coming into both partners as a couple jointly, and how the actions of, say, one partner in a couple can affect how both partners in the couple experience universal credit around things like conditionality. So our study was a 3-year qualitative and longitudinal research project, and we had 2 waves of interviews in England and in Scotland. And our study took place firstly sort of before COVID, when we did our first set of interviews, and then our second wave of interviews occurred during COVID. So our first phase interviews took place in late 2018 and early 2019. And then we did 123 face-to-face interviews with 90 people from 53 households. So we did individual interviews with each partner in a couple, and then with as many as we possibly could, we also did a joint interview. And the focus on our report from that phase, which was published in June 2020, was on household, money and universal credit payment issues. And then in phase 2, so for the second phase of our interviews, when we interviewed people again in late 2020, we managed to interview 63 of those 90 participants, and those interviews we did over the telephone because of COVID, and those were people were from 39 households, and it's those findings that we're publishing today in our report. So overall, across both phases of the research, we had quite a lot of interview material. We had 186 interviews and transcripts, which we analysed. Next slide, please, Sophie. Thank you. Okay, so just to say a bit more about our phase 2 sample. So of the 39 households, 28 were still in couples when we interviewed them at phase 2. So that's 24 who had dependent children and 4 who didn't have dependent children. And 6 were lone parents and 5 were single people. We should say that some of those lone parents and single people had actually become lone parents and single people before we interviewed them at phase 1, but they had previously been in couples. So they had that experience. So there was quite a lot of change which occurred between the two phases of our interviews. So 9 babies were born to 8 couples, and 3 participants were also pregnant when we interviewed them at phase 2. 7 couples had split up, of whom 2 got back together, again with the same partner. And unfortunately, one of our participants had died. So of the 39 households, 23 had at least one partner in work at phase 2. 34 were still receiving universal credit, and all have been universal credit claimants for at least 2 years, and some for as many as 5 years. So we did also have a look at those who didn't participate in our second phase of fieldwork, and we did notice that they were sort of generally facing the more complex issues. So that's just something worth noting. Next slide, please, Sophie. So just to talk a bit about the analysis and findings. So it was a longitudinal study, as I've mentioned, and we structured our findings according to the employment status at, or in a few cases, before our first phase of interviews. So we grouped everyone into their sort of earner status as they were at the initial points when we first interviewed, or for a few just before that. So we had 10 2-earner households, 13 1-earner households, and 16 no-earner households. And then we used an in-depth sort of narrative case summary approach. So we, based on the first person accounts, using all the interview transcripts, we explored specific issues, but we kind of looked at how people's situations were changing over time, and we wrote some narrative case summaries. And then we looked at the issues in more detail. So the key things we were trying to explore were: what employment transitions did people experience over time? What work care decisions and arrangements they made and why? And what influence universal credit's main policy levers have, such as the work allowance, the 63% taper, which was what was in operation when we were doing our field work, the childcare cost element, conditionality regime, and employment support. And then we explored how well the assumptions underlying universal credit's theory of behaviour change fit the reality of people's lives. So next slide. I think I did see Rita pop up, but I can carry on until she appears fully. There. Hi, Rita.
That's fine. If you want to just carry on and I'll take over from the next slide.
Yeah, okay, fine, sure, fine. Okay, so in this slide, we just look at the sort of the key employment transitions for the households that we interviewed. So of the 16 households that had no earner at the start, 12 still had no one in paid work at phase 2, and some have become single earner households. Sorry, I'm slightly covering that number there. Yeah, so 4 had become single earner households. And then of the 13 with 1 earner, 7 were still 1 earner couples, and 3 had become 2 earner couples. 1 had no earner, and 2 had split up and formed 2 separate households. And then of the 10 with 2 earners, 6 couples still had 2 earners. 1 had become a 1 earner, 1 had become a no earner couple, and 1 had split up and formed 2 separate 1 earner households.
Great. Okay, so if we start with our no earner couples, so it was one of our largest groups of couples in our research, and of course there are good reasons why people aren't earning in universal credit, and often that's because people have disabilities or they have children with disabilities and they're not able to work. So many of our couples who weren't earning were either looking after a partner who had a disability or a mental health condition, or they had a child who did. And often there was no work conditionality for either member of the couple in this situation. And generally speaking, it suited most couples, but not all. So in some cases, the caring partner who had no work conditionality would have actually liked to have contact and support with a work coach, but wasn't able to get it because neither partner had any work conditionality. So it's a kind of structural problem within the system in terms of contact and employment support that people get that we might want to discuss later. So for couples who were in the intensive work search group, so couples with no earners, so unemployed couples who had no other source of income and had no limited capacity for work, we found that these were the couples that struggled the most, not unexpectedly. And here it reflects findings. Perhaps some of you saw the COVID realities presentation earlier in the week. Our findings very much support theirs, which is the income inadequacy, compounded often by automated deductions within universal credit. They feature strongly in the narratives of unemployed couples, particularly with children, and particularly affected were those who were impacted by the 2-child limit, and also younger parents as well, and younger couples under the age of 25 who have a lower standard allowance. And of course, these kinds of issues about income inadequacy have been compounded by the loss of the £20 uplift. During our research, they actually still had it, so they were still struggling, even though they were in most cases, well, they were in all cases getting the £20 uplift. And often those who were required to undertake intensive job search often found it unproductive. The employment support was felt to be very generic, not tailored to their individual needs, although many people reported having a good relationship with a work coach, but the kind of support that they were able to offer was fairly limited. We also find in this group that social services wasn't uncommon, that a few of the couples who were classified as having no dependent children actually had children taken into the care system. And in fact, a couple without children who subsequently had a child had that child removed by the time of our second phase research. So having little or no furniture, relying on food banks, unable to heat the home properly. All this reflects having to manage on a very low income, but of course it's also the sort of things that's likely to come to the attention of social services. And so this was something that mothers in particular were really concerned about. It was a source of significant stress, the fear of having their children removed due to poor home circumstances. Okay, we could move on to the next slide, please, Sophie. Okay, so the findings for one earner couple. So most one-earner couples in this research had preschool age children. And so the primary driver of the kind of decisions that they were making around work and care arrangements was to ensure that they had one parent at home to look after them. In very few cases, it was 2 part-time earners, which I'll come on to later. But in the majority of cases, this was a choice that they'd made to look after, for one parent to look after the children at home. That was also reflected by not wanting to use paid childcare. So they just organise their working lives around the fact that that they wanted to minimise the use of paid childcare, and so that one parent was always available. So generally speaking, this reflected a personal choice. And also, these are the kinds of findings that we find in research going back many years, but where our findings deviated from that research was that historically this kind of division of labour in 2-parent families with one earner and one parent staying home was often reflected a traditional division of gendered division of labour between usually a male breadwinner and a female home carer. But actually we didn't find that in our research. We found that the decisions were reflecting more the practicalities of who can drive in the couple, who may be ill or disabled or not, and often just who finds a job first. And so what we tended to find as well is that looking over a period of time is that who was the lead carer in a couple and who was the earner often switched between the members of a couple. They weren't necessarily tied to those traditional roles. And something else that was apparent over time is that as people got to understand universal credit, and they understood how the taper, which at the time of the research was 63%, this had tended to kind of minimise rather than maximise the working hours that people did. And that wasn't just the loss of entitlement to universal credit, but also the loss of entitlement to other means tested benefits. So, for example, help with council tax support, free school meals, prescriptions. All these are impacted as earnings increase, and people found that difficult to manage, something I'll come on to in the next slide. But something else that was very specific to couples, the fact that there's a single payment. So often higher earnings of one partner would reduce the amount of universal credit paid to the other. So it could actually have an impact on the distribution of income within the family, which sometimes set up unhelpful dynamics as well. And people were making the choice perhaps not to work extra hours in order not to reduce their partner's earnings. Okay, we can have the next slide, please. So we found with our one earner couples, in terms of the conditionality regime, that they were treated, even though many of them, I should have said, were actually working part-time, they were treated generally with a fairly light touch. It should be said that during our second phase research, the conditionality regime was affected by the loosening of the conditionality requirements as a result of the pandemic. So generally speaking, there was very little contact between work coaches and claimants at this time. But even prior to that, we found that that most couples who'd made a decision to have one earner, even when it was one part-time earner, were generally left to their own devices by work coaches. However, we did pick up on some fairly variable and inconsistent treatment. So couples in very similar circumstances in terms of the earnings and the number of parents who were working were actually treated rather differently depending on which part of the country they were in, but also by different work coaches as well. And the other issue that we hit against was that some potential second earners, because the higher earnings of their partner, they actually had no contact with the work coach again and would have liked them. So we found that the conditionality regime was actually driving the kind of support and help that people were getting, rather than necessarily the individual needs and aspirations of the partners. Next slide, please. Okay. Okay, so moving on to our two earner couples, I should stress really that We did find some positives in the research. They weren't all difficulties and there were some couples that did like universal credit. They liked the single payment. And one of the things that they particularly liked was the automatic top up to universal credit when wages drop. Of course, that's the reverse of how it was expected to impact on people. But the fact that if wages drop due to sickness, for example, often people were in jobs that didn't pay sick pay. So universal credit rising when wages dropped was actually very helpful to people, the fact that they didn't have to claim an additional benefit. And also, of course, the lower risk of overpayments, and people mentioned compared with tax credits if they've been impacted on that previously. But we did find that through all the narratives really of our two-earner couples was the challenge of juggling work and care, and there was little evidence that we found that the help available within universal credit was actually helping them with those challenges. So something I've been speaking about to the Work and Pensions Committee this morning is just the fact that the childcare support offered within universal credit we found to be very unwieldy for couples with children. Both parents, of course, have to work in two-parent families if they're to access childcare help within universal credit. So the fact that payments had to be found upfront and reclaimed in arrears, something the committee was very concerned about. But actually, we found with two earners who often had overcome this barrier, partly possibly because there were earnings, but often people did borrow the money from family. But actually it was the subjecting of entitlement to childcare help to a monthly means test. So the fact that universal credit is tapered along with other elements, along with earnings, and the all-in-one nature of the payment. So it's really hard to separate out the childcare element within universal credit from any other help and support that they get. This was particularly problematic. So just managing a payment that fluctuated month to month, it was very hard to predict in advance what help they would get with childcare. Actually left some second earners who tended to be women in debt because they weren't getting the help that they thought they might. And some actually we found reduced their hours or left jobs counter to the policy intent, just in order to stabilise their universal credit payment and to reduce the stress and of hassle of actually reclaiming their child costs monthly. And then as children, as young as children became eligible for the government's free childcare, so generally 3 and 4 year olds, they tended to switch to the free provision, which they found much easier. There's higher awareness, much higher take up than the childcare element of universal credit. The other big finding that I've alluded to is just the extent to which this super responsive mean testing with universal credit, so every month there is a monthly assessment and a means test, it was creating quite a lot of additional stress and burden. Again, having gendered effects tended to affect women more than men in couples because they tended to do more of the budgeting, they tended to do more of the childcare arranging. And we also found that this sometimes followed through into couples' relationships. So it could create instability. Not all our couples stayed together. So the reasons why couples separate are very complex, but this was an added burden that could actually tip some couples over the edge, and some did actually separate. Okay, next slide, please. All right. Some people we found as well, in order to remove themselves from the stress and burden, is they actually did increase their hours, as universal credit did intend, but often this involves significant trade-offs in terms of work-life balance. So earning more for these couples to take them out of eligibility for universal credit often meant that they were working long hours, and again that could impact relationships, it impacted family time, so it didn't suit everybody. So we found that work behaviours were adjusted, but not necessarily as intended by policy. So the taper was discouraging longer hours, particularly among second earners. The kind of work that people was doing was an added constraint because people weren't able simply to work extra hours or do an extra shift. Often it was down to their employers to determine the kind of hours of work that they did. And as we said, some did increase their earnings and leave universal credit, but more people reduced them or left jobs. And the main drivers here, which play to some of the assumptions underlying universal credit that I know Fran wants to talk about more, is just the extent to which people were concerned to reduce the amount of uncertainty. They wanted stability, they wanted reliability, to know how much they had to budget every month. And so often their work behaviours were influenced more by that than necessarily maximising income. So I come to my final slide now. Thank you, Sophie. So what are our key takeaways? So we found that the policy levers in universal credit, so the work allowance, the taper, the help with childcare costs, they were actually having a fairly limited influence over the decisions couples or the arrangements couples were making about who worked, how many hours they worked. And often this work-life balance was more important to couples than maximising household income. And that actually applied to working and non-working couples. And to an extent, the pandemic has played into that. People spending more time at home with their children are thinking, well, actually, maybe a simpler life is preferable, especially when children are young. Always maximising household income when there are big trade-offs is perhaps not the best way forward. So the other key takeaway is the extent to which couples are affected differently and the different partners within a couple are affected differently within universal credit. So we know that universal credit affects lone parents in a particular way. It was mainly designed for single claimants. And what we're finding is actually its impacts on couples are really quite different to single claimants and lone parents. And in this sense, there's perhaps overall a bit of a mismatch between how universal credit has been designed in order to change behaviour, or how it thought it would change work behaviour, and how people are actually responding to it in practice. And it's suggesting in particular that a rethink is really needed, particularly if more mothers in couples are going to be encouraged into work or to earn more, which is actually key to the success of universal credit. So at that point, I'm going to hand over to Fran, who's going to talk more about those assumptions and the policy side of things.
Thank you, Sophie, and thank you very much, Rita. I'm just going to highlight a few reflections briefly, and that's for two reasons. One is that some of the policy implications have already been raised by what Marcia and Rita have said, and we actually have two speakers giving responses shortly who may also do that. And the second is that this is not really a report about whether universal credit works or not. It's a report about whether the assumptions behind the design of universal credit appear to fit with our participants' lives and therefore their experience of and responses to universal credit. So we looked at key areas of concern that they had. Now, one of those was about financial incentives, which have been talked about. And it's certainly true that some people appreciated the responsive nature of universal credit, in particular because that meant that there weren't any overpayments and their earnings were by and large reported automatically to the government. But the monthly means test, as Rita has said, led to fluctuations in income, which were one of the big issues that we found for people. These were hard work, they were stressful, and they caused difficulties in budgeting. I mean, universal credit was intended to make it clearer to people how they should budget. And these, particularly for people in work, caused difficulties in budgeting. And those were, of course, doubled for those people who had two members of the couple in work. And that makes it quite hard to see the direct line to claimant behaviour because of the fluctuations in income, which were going on for those people with earners. And in addition, the pattern of incentives in universal credit for couples doesn't really match what we know about who's more susceptible to incentives. So the research in the past has tended to show us that, quote, second earners in couples are more responsive, and that mothers with children, for example, are more responsive to whether they can get more or less in terms of their income in work. But of course, the pattern of incentives in universal credit, as people know who've been debating it for a decade, was to facilitate single earner couples in particular, because the government's focus was workless households rather than individual earners. And so the pattern of incentives doesn't really match what we know about how incentives work, if you like. And the other issue is that the reduction in the taper to 55% and the increase in the work allowance by £500 a year, both of which happened after our research, will mean that universal credit goes higher up the income scale. The extra income, of course, will be very much welcomed by people, but the increase in the work allowance in particular, because there's only one per couple, will tilt the balance further towards one earner households within the universal credit system. Next slide, thanks, Sophie. So looking at other elements of the universal credit design, employment support and childcare are parts of those, parts of that design. And as Rita has said, some work coaches were certainly very helpful to claimants, and that was very much appreciated. But the support that they could give was often quite limited, and the support was sometimes inconsistent. In terms of conditionality, one of the other issues about there being apparently less clear divisions of labour by gender than there have been in the past was that those people who did comment on the idea of nominating a lead carer were not that keen on that. They'd said that isn't really how we work as a couple, and there was no recognition within the conditionality regime of the non-lead carer's parenting role at all. And therefore that was seen to be rather rigid in terms of how couples work these days. And in relation to childcare, as came out very clearly in the oral evidence to the Work and Pensions Committee this morning, which I was listening to, the design appears to have been motivated more by a desire to avoid fraud and also overpayments, which wasn't mentioned so much this morning, rather than the kind of design that can best help claimants get into work and get on in work, as was intended by universal credit. We also found that other factors were important in what couples did and why, and not just the universal credit system. So one is lack of control over jobs and hours. In other words, the kind of employment that the couples would go into meant that they couldn't necessarily just increase their hours or increase their earnings when they desired to. And there were also other motivations for behavioural change, as has come out very clearly in what's been said so far, particularly related to how the couple worked as a family with their children. The fact that universal credit adjusted when earnings were lower and income was lower was appreciated by some people. So the upwards adjustment of universal credit when income was lower was certainly appreciated. And some people came off universal credit by working more. That's absolutely true. So clearly there was an effect in terms of people becoming independent of benefit, which was again another huge motive behind the design of universal credit. But that was often because people wanted to leave universal credit itself. They wanted to leave it because of what they found to be intrusiveness and the impact of the taper on their additional earnings and so on. And I think what these kinds of issues led us to discuss was whether the impact of the monthly means test, in other words, the fact that you got means tested at the end of every month in universal credit, had been sufficiently considered when the design was thought up. And I think you can guess that our answer was perhaps that had not been sufficiently considered in the design. Last slide, thanks, Sophie. So the research also made us think more generally about how couples are treated within universal credit. And it's very interesting that the business case for universal credit says that the preferred work hours that people want are assumed to be possible in the business case. And the other thing that the business case said is that one partner's decisions on work and hours are assumed to be unaffected by the other partner's work and hours. Now, both of those things, we would argue from our research, are rather heroic assumptions, to say the least. So the ways in which couples work are not necessarily taken into account sufficiently within the design of universal credit or the aims which it wants to achieve. And it foregrounds household, not individual income. So the administrative earnings threshold and the conditionality earnings threshold, both of which are triggers for different conditionalities within the universal credit scheme, are both household thresholds as well as individual thresholds, for example. So what happens to one partner's earnings can affect the other partner's conditionality very clearly. There has been certainly a shift from a focus on workless households, which I talked about as being an initial motivator behind universal credit, to the current focus, which is more on in-work progression. And that would suggest that there's less of a focus on the household and more of a focus on the individual now. I think we would argue that if that is to be the case, there is an argument to review the incentives and how they affect second earners in particular, and the conditionality rules and how those work for couples in particular. And in terms of just generally policy areas to consider, we would therefore think that especially for those with no other income, the adequacy of universal credit remains key. It's key for everybody, but particularly for those who don't have other income as well. For those who have one or two earners, it appears to us that security is often seen as more important than the super responsiveness of universal credit, which happens every month. The design issues that we've picked out as of key concern are the way in which the reimbursement of childcare costs works in universal credit and the monthly means test, as I've just said. We would also think that there's a difficulty in dividing the job seeker and the lead carer roles rigidly these days, and the evidence we have points to the need for more flexibility in that, as well as, I should say, in terms of carer and cared for roles when it comes to people who are disabled or have disabilities because of old age. And wider policy issues, in conclusion, are also relevant. So we are not going to solve all the problems that our couples experienced just through the universal credit system itself. There's also, in particular, the quality of work, the accessibility of transport to the kinds of work that people got, and so on. So this is a policy area which is wider than just universal credit, wider than just the benefit system more generally, and also includes the labour market and the nature of that, and our public services, including transport. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much indeed to Fran and to Rita and to Marsha for the presentation of the research and some of the questions it raises. Some really important policy issues there raised by Fran at the end. And I suppose overall, you know, one might take from this research is rather like the sort of famous words of James Scott, the problems of seeing like a state, that the you know, the design principles, the ways in which universal credit has been configured and implemented at considerable variance from the experience, the needs, the desires, the ambitions of couples in receipt of universal credit, and very specific ways in which that's happening that come from this research. So we're going to now have some responses, first from Ryan Shorthouse and then Kate Summers, and then we'll open up to debate. We've got some questions already in the chat, but Ryan, if I can pass to you, please, Ryan.
Great, thank you. And it's good to be joining this session. I'm actually at the British Academy at a Bright Blue conference at the moment, and I'm just between sessions. And I wanted to accept this invitation because it's really good work. So, like I say, I think the work really adds to and strengthens the evidence base which has been emerging around the impact of universal credit. And what I want to do now is just zoom out a bit and think about some of the political implications of the research. I think the first thing to note is that in recent times, there has been a shift in opinion on universal credit, that it's had a good pandemic. It's delivered quite well during the pandemic, and that sort of paints how policymakers, decision makers, journalists see universal credit. They broadly see it as working, and as the number of people came on to universal credit during the pandemic accelerated quite substantially, it coped, and DWP as an organisation coped as well. And we've done some work at Bright Blue, which just showed the level of increase, particularly during the first year of the pandemic, of the number of people coming onto UC as a result not only of unemployment, but reduced income or reduced hours as a result of the lockdown measures that were put in place. And London in particular, but also what you might call the government's left behind areas, coastal areas, former industrial areas, saw the biggest leaps in claimants. But as I say, I think the political narrative around universal credit is that it's delivered well during the pandemic, and the design of it is broadly a good thing. Evidence we've done, and this evidence here challenges some of those assumptions. It does pick up on some of the positives, quite rightly, that some claimants are experiencing with universal credit, but it does challenge some of those assumptions. And I just want to talk through some of that. But one thing I would say is that we've done work in the past and others, which really has brought out that the big issues that claimants have are around the frequency of payment, monthly away from, say, fortnightly or weekly, as some claimants were used to. And also there was a bit in the evidence of concern around it going to one member of the household and the implications that might have for the power dynamics between men and women, and the independence, particularly financial independence of women. And it's interesting that that doesn't necessarily come through, those two issues there don't come that strongly through this work on couples and universal credit, which I think is quite interesting. But as I say, I think some of the research found here does challenge some of the assumptions behind the design elements of universal credit. The first is around simplicity. And of course, research we've done at Bright Blue and the department's done suggests that the rolling together of 6 out of work, in work benefits into a kind of single taper rate would help claimants understand more the implications of increased hours and what that would do to their overall income. And also the idea that that simplicity would lead to less engagement with different agencies and departments, because you have now one super benefit rather than 6 individual ones interacting with different departments. However, it doesn't seem to be the case from this research that for couples, that single taper rate really is providing clarity on the kind of income effects of changing work patterns. And indeed, from the research, it seemed to be suggesting that sometimes the complexity for couples is putting people off from increasing their hours. And of course, some people were reassured when they left UC because of perhaps some of the complexities involved. And it seems that some people are worried about the withdrawal of income as they increase their hours and the loss of entitlements, and that comes through. So it seems that the guiding principle behind universal credit, one of which is simplicity, isn't really being experienced by couples in the way that perhaps the department previously envisaged. The second is around employment incentives, which I found very interesting, which is obviously the assumption is that a single clear taper rate would show to people the benefits of working additional hours on top of conditionality arrangements being in place to encourage certain claimants to increase their hours in their income. The sort of lesson that's coming through this research is that actually claimants and couples seem to be responding to, it seems to be factors outside of that which are influencing their desire to work more hours or not. And this obviously challenges the government's assumptions behind a single taper rate improving work incentives. And it also challenges the big policy choice that the government have made recently, which is instead of keeping the £20 weekly uplift, to instead reduce the taper rate. But of course, if this evidence seemed to be suggesting that people are not really necessarily responding that strongly, particularly couples, to that single taper rate, it does make you wonder whether it will have the desired effect of improving work incentives and really help with the bigger issue that comes through the research, which is inadequate income, which, you know, the uplift was helping much more people with that. I would say, though, I did find it slightly contradictory across the evidence in terms of the observations between 2 earner couples and 1 earner couples, because of course the narrative from 2 earner couples was that the taper rate didn't seem to have a huge impact on whether people decided to work more hours or not. But the kind of message that I was getting through from 1 earner couples was that actually the entitlements were having an impact, or the fear of the loss of entitlements were having an impact on whether people worked more hours or not. So I think there's just, you know, I don't think this is necessarily something which is deliberately done or an error by researchers, but it's just interesting to know the overall message here, which is, are the design elements of UC in terms of the work allowance, the taper rate, are they having a huge impact on people's decision to work more hours or fewer hours, or are they not? I found the slight sort of, for 2 earners and 1 earner couples, a slightly different message, and it would be good just to have a bit more clarification on that. I think the third issue that came through was work coaches, and previous Bright Blue work that we did a couple of years ago showed, for actually a lot of claimants that we interviewed, that work coaches were one of the most important and popular parts of universal credit. That kind of one-to-one engagement was valued a lot by claimants. And of course, that was a time when we did the interviews when the caseloads of UC work coaches were a lot lower as a result of fewer people being on them. What's interesting here, and the message that I'm getting, of course, it's not the same for everybody, and some people report having positive experiences with work coaches, but the overall message I'm getting is that actually people didn't want to engage that much with their work coaches, didn't really get huge amounts of value from it. And I think this sort of points to a wider philosophical or political point about the benefit system, which is, you know, a lot of people have sort of really trumpeted the idea of personal intensive support for claimants beyond just financial transfers as important, as a kind of, you know, a sort of relational state, not just a transactional state. And those sorts of people have been, I suppose, quite averse to things like the universal basic income, because they feel it's sort of policymakers saying, here's the money and then we'll wash our hands of it. You know, we won't have conditionality and things like that. We'll just give it to claimant, but then you don't have that personal intensive relationship or support. But this evidence, interestingly, on balance, seems to suggest actually that sort of more hands-off, non-conditionality, almost UBI-esque approach might be something which is a little bit more welcome by claimants than the sort of personal intensive support from work coaches. That was, you know, I apologize if I've got that wrong, but that was perhaps some of the implications I got from the research. Fourthly, just on childcare, I was actually struck just by the aversion to, particularly amongst 1 earner couples, to using paid childcare when the children was particularly older in the preschool years. I found that quite interesting, because obviously this does raise important implications, not only for poverty, as the evidence is you know, quite striking that 2 earner couples are much less likely to be in poverty than 1 earner couples, but also for long-term children's outcomes as well, because we know from the evidence that participation in high quality childcare from about the age of 2 is good, particularly for deprived children in terms of their cognitive and social development. And so I do think it raises questions about, particularly for beyond the age of 2, what sort of policies are in place, even, you know, in terms of compulsory hours, a certain number of hours for participation in childcare for children, considering the educational benefits. But also, I think when children are younger, just what's coming through is, you know, actually increased hours or increased income are not necessarily the most important thing to people, but actually spending time with children, particularly in those first few years. We all know that, you know, the maternity paternity pay system is the statutory amount that you get is measly, it's very low, and the support that you can get from benefits as well may not be isn't adequate enough to support often one earner couples. So I think there's I think there's a wider debate here about children very young. For those parents who want to stay at home, the support that's in place through universal credit, but also through the leave system, and then thinking more broadly about the role of childcare, not just as a service for working parents, but as a critical part of the education system as well. And then the final point, which Fran was talking about at the end, was just what really struck me was, and I don't know if this is a sort of, the pandemic has accelerated this thinking, but really the prioritization on stability of income and the prioritization of work-life balance above, for example, maximizing hours and income. And I just think that is really interesting and challenges both thinking on the right and the left. On the right, you know, this idea that we're all rational actors just responding to monetary incentives, challenges some of that sort of free market, public market-based thinking. But it also challenges perhaps some people on the left who have championed for a long time increasing work, access to work and the number of hours in work as a way of fighting poverty. And the evidence is clear on that would help. But obviously that is perhaps conflicting with some of the preferences that people have around the way that they want to conduct their lives and the happiness that they get from that. And I think that's quite interesting and a challenge both to sort of prevailing left and right-wing thinking. So in conclusion, I think the kind of policy implications of this research, the first is this sort of big debate about whether it's best to go for a taper rate rather than maintain the weekly uplift. My feeling is this evidence suggests that actually the adequacy and stability of income is very important, and therefore the weekly uplift have been more effective. Issues around childcare, particularly being paid in arrears, is an ongoing issue, and Fran's just talked about it and raised issues which were raised in the select committee today. But also how we create that support for people when children are very young, and then thinking about the role of formal, even compulsory childcare when children are a little bit older. And then I think the final thing is just, I think there is a shift in attitudes which I've seen from survey evidence on public attitudes towards social security. It seems to, in recent years, become more generous. I think the pandemic has shown that our lot in life is not necessarily just as a product of our hard work or agency, but luck, and sometimes brute luck. And the pandemic has showed that very strongly. And I hope that does feed into, particularly on the centre right, a recognition, and I think it is to some extent, a recognition that you do need a strong social security system to maintain support for a market-based system, but also maintain participation in the market-based system as well. So really, really interesting research project, I think adds a lot to the accumulating evidence on UC.
Great, Ryan, thank you very much indeed. I mean, those are really insightful comments, and you raised some really important issues there about childcare, early learning, and as you say, the balance between work and care in people's lives, and these questions about childhood and how we integrate considerations about childhood and early child development. I think we definitely want to come back to that in the discussion. So thank you very much, Ryan. Now, Kate, I'm going to ask you to come in if you would as well, and with your comments, and then we'll open up. We've got about 6 or 7 questions, so plenty to discuss. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Nick. Thanks very much for having me here to comment. Before sharing my comments, I just wanted to congratulate the research team on this amazing research project that's generated such rich data, providing such comprehensive insights to inform policy. And I also more specifically wanted to congratulate Marsha and Rita, who are the ones who interviewed the couples. I think just to recognise how skilled it is to conduct interviews about such intimate and personal aspects of people's lives, and sort of the sensitivity skill that requires to earn people's trust and confidence. So yeah, I just wanted to recognise that. I'll split my reflections into two parts. First, I wanted to comment briefly on a couple of the key concepts in this report that it made me think about more deeply when reading it. And secondly, I wanted to share a few reflections about the methods of the study and pose a few questions that might carry through into the Q&A. So first, in terms of key concepts or ideas, so the first one maybe sort of very clearly and as what's been picked up in the presentations and Ryan's comments as well, but I suppose to explicitly recognise the contribution that this research makes in terms of understanding decision making, both academically but also in relation to policy making. How do we think about decision making within households? And I think what this report is really pushing us to do and is adding to this debate to make us think about how we can move beyond what some people call a rational economic man model of decision making, and think instead, how do we think about more broadly how various social and cultural contexts matter when people are navigating work, care, social security. And I find it striking the report discusses the universal credits theory of change. Maybe this will come up in the Q&A as well, and sort of how maybe that's not an appropriate way of understanding how UC operates in these couples' lives. Perhaps instead we need to think about how UC sort of fits within this more complicated landscape of people's lives rather than leading it. There are a few findings I'll just cite that really struck me in relation to this, that maybe the research team would like to talk more about. So this has come up already, but the finding about how households with preschool age children tended to show a strong preference for children being cared for in the home rather than formal childcare. And relatedly, what this told us about contemporary gender roles and how that's actually challenging or moving forward sort of older work that relates to this area. I thought that was really striking. I think secondly, the finding about how ironically some couples cited the option to work fewer hours without being heavily financially penalised by universal credit as a positive aspect of the benefit of the policy design, which is obviously sort of counter to one of the kind of overarching intended aims of UC, but I think that's really interesting to understand how that is operating, that decisions being made in couples' lives. And the third finding I just raise and cite that I thought was striking and very upsetting is how in the report there's testimony from couples who were deciding to go ahead with having a third child, despite knowing that the 2-child limit would be applied to them. And in the excerpts from the interviews that cited couples talking about the sort of firmly held and often sort of the moral nature of the decisions that they were making when they were choosing to go ahead with this third pregnancy, and sort of how jarring that is with the assumption that the 2-child limit would offer sort of a financial structure with which to make that sort of decision. It's just kind of is so stark when you look at that example there of how we need a better account of decision making. So I suppose I'd ask the research team as well whether they have or whether they are planning to develop an alternative theory of change to challenge or kind of complement the existing theory of change that exists for universal credit. Secondly, sort of substantively, I wanted to make a more specific point about care. And of course, it's very visible in this research project, care in relation to children, and we've heard a lot about childcare and childcare decision making. But I was also really struck reading the report how care is really important in the context of couples themselves. And so I mean this in the sense that so in part the longitudinal design meant that researchers could view and recognise coupledom as something that's dynamic. So it's not static. Relationships ended in the course of the project. Some relationships reformed. And I think what then was very powerful is that then the researchers could show us the stress and the burden that universal credit played in these couples' relationships, and some couples citing universal credit as a factor that was leading or playing a part in their relationship breakdown. So I think this recognition of what care might mean very broadly when we're thinking about universal credit in people's lives, it's obviously much broader than just income level. It's much broader than just how the childcare aspect of it works. So then I'll just finish with 3 very short kind of key methods, I suppose, reflections, but really questions that I'd sort of pose to the research team. And I, just very briefly as well, I thought it was very effective in the report, the long report. I think it's really fantastic the research team share in-depth sort of cases of the different couples. And so by doing it like that, rather than showing us kind of cross-cutting themes, we can see the complexity playing out within these individual couples, within these households. And we're sort of shown that up front in how the findings have been written, which I thought was very effective. So 3 short key methods points. I'm interested to hear more about the ethics of interviewing couples. I suppose there's key decisions about confidentiality and anonymity when you're entering into a household, the sort of what you think you owe, or maybe what you're trying to navigate between interviewing couples separately and together. I'd be really interested to hear more about that. The second methodological point was, I thought it was really interesting that the report seemed to take the sort of decision or stance of researching through COVID rather than about COVID. And so Marsha talked about moving to telephone interviews to deal with the COVID context. But I'd be interested to hear more about the kind of interpretation of the data that allowed you to still center your key themes of looking at couples, care, work, universal credit. And it seemed like that was happening sort of within the pandemic, rather than the pandemic becoming the overarching story or thing that was going on there. When obviously a lot of research at the moment is being totally like derailed or refocused. And so hearing a bit more about what that looked like for your couples' lives as you came back to them to interview them again. And the final methodological point I wanted to make was about the longitudinal design being 2 years apart and thinking about the types of insights that this generates. I thought was very interesting. So like I just said, being able to see, for example, couple breakdown or formation, sort of strain or success over a long period of time. But I suppose you can contrast that with much more short-term longitudinal designs. So I guess I'm thinking about work like John Hills and colleagues at Case, who in the mid-2000s surveyed households weekly to understand what was happening with their income. David Young, who is at Bath at IPR, his PhD, was doing much more frequent financial diaries. And so I suppose my final sort of question or comment was, if you had more resources or access, what would you have wanted to maybe add or differ in terms of complementary data collection at points in time to kind of enrich this even further? I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Kate. Those are excellent questions, and I completely concur with the remark you made at the beginning of your contribution that you know, this research is testament to the professional research skills, the very important qualitative research skills that the team have, and the sensitivity that's required in doing this work to generate the kind of insights and evidence that it does. So thank you very much, Kate. And you raised some very important methodological issues there at the end. Perhaps we could ask the team to come to those a bit later on, and perhaps with Jane on the call too. I don't know if David Young is with us, but Jane was his lead supervisor, and so would perhaps be able to reflect on that point you made, Kate, about the different intervals for longitudinal research design. But let's go perhaps to the research team then, just to respond to some of these questions. We've got quite a few in the chat. I mean, so in the Q&A, I should say. So please do just sort of pull some of these out. But I think there's a lot of questions about the gender split, about both, you know, decisions about UC and about work and care. There's a lot of questions about the relationship between UC and the labour market, the insecurity in the labour market, unpredictable employment, gig economy employment, and so on, and the relationship between, you know, insecure in employment and the need for security. And then we've got obviously a set of very specific questions about things like the taper, passporting questions, and those issues, and then a wide range of questions about children, in particular childcare, the ones that Ryan raised, but also Kate at the end there on the 2-child limit, and what we've seen recently with the increase in poverty in families with 3 or more children. So a whole bunch of questions. Perhaps if I could ask Rita first to come back to some of those to kick us off.
Oh wow! Yes, there's a lot there, isn't there?
There is a lot there. So please take this. Don't feel you have to respond to every single point in all detail. But if you could pick up on some of them, that would be great. So. Yeah,
I'm trying to see if I can sort of look at them in a sort of more holistic way. I think both it sort of plays to the methods that we use and just how this research is conducted and how policy is designed is just starting with the people that you're targeting the policies on, is having a really clear understanding of their lives and therefore how they're likely to respond to these policies. I think a lot of our findings reflect the way in which universal credit has been designed by economists, really. It's very much based on, it's been referred to as a sort of rational economic model, but this idea that people respond in almost a sort of automated way to work incentives or financial incentives. And we all know that that's not the case. We all have complex lives, but particularly families with children, the kind of social and cultural context, I think is just so important to that, which is often ignored. I think when universal credit was initially being designed, there was some contact with stakeholders, but there was very little contact with actual claimants, and the system itself was never piloted in real life. And you'd think for such a huge radical redesign of the social security system that there would have been some piloting to actually find out how these changes were affecting people in their everyday lives, and it was never done. It's almost like it was a huge social experiment that we're only now just kind of discovering how it's impacting on people. So I think it does tell us a lot about the need to speak to people who are actually claiming these benefits and having to live through it. I think that's one thing. And then I suppose the other thing is change over time, really. One of the things that our research was able to do, that Kate referred to, is look back over a period. So again, a lot of evaluation research that's done by the likes of the DWP focuses on the policies rather than on the people. And I'm not sure the expression that Kate used, but I think that's right. She said researching through COVID rather than about it. And it's a similar thing. We didn't start with universal credit. We started with our couples, and then universal credit is clearly a big part of their lives in the same way as COVID became. But they were what we were following in our research rather than necessarily these policies. So I think that's the power of longitudinal qualitative research. I think that profiling, economic modelling just cannot reach these kinds of issues. I don't know if Jane would like to add to that, possibly.
Thank you very much. It's really interesting comments. I've been looking over Kate's comment about an alternative theory of change, actually, because I think that is really interesting and important. And some of the psychological work, which focuses on things like autonomy and relationships and connections with other people, it seems to me offer a different way into thinking about what makes a difference to people. So I think there are ways in which we might think differently. We hadn't gone down that route of thinking of an alternative theory of change, but it's an interesting idea, and I think we might take that one up. While I've got the floor, can I go back to a couple of Ryan's points?
Yes.
Lots of good points there, Ryan, but one of the things you said was we hadn't talked much about single payments and monthly payments. We covered that much more in our first report, so we haven't covered it so much this time round, but we did have a lot to say about it when we looked at it the first time round. And your second really interesting and important question about, is the message a bit mixed on whether these levers are working or not? And it kind of goes back to Fran's comment that we're not trying to understand whether they're working or not. We're trying to understand the assumptions behind them and how they relate to people's behaviour. And I think the answer is it's quite complicated. The levers don't work in the same way for everyone. So you can't just say this lever will do that and people will respond in that way. The way in which the lever might work will be very different relating to people's different circumstances and situations. And the nature of change, the dynamics of the change and how quickly their situations are changing. So I think there isn't perhaps a simple answer to that question about whether the policy levers work or not.
Thank you, Jane. Can I just jump in and ask the team to address a couple of specific points that have come up in the Q&A? So Elaine Kempson raising questions about passporting and how, not taken on board in the initial design of UC, raised since by the Social Security Advisory Committee. I mean, perhaps Fran, could you address that one on passporting? And then there's a couple of questions, Dee and Ruth and others, on self-employment and whether people prefer self-employment or whether self-employment is problematic in the UC. Perhaps Rita, you could say something about that. And then Marsha, just if you would, I know you've done a lot of work on childcare in particular, and responding perhaps to some of Ryan's points, but others have raised. I mean, is one of the answers here to take the childcare element out of the UC and put it across into supply funding like the early years entitlement, or to find some other means of making childcare support predictable within the universal credit, so not fluctuating, not as responsive to individual. I mean, thinking about, for example, the tax relief for higher earners or middle and higher earners, very straightforward tax relief system compared to the much more complex means tested system for universal credit childcare elements. So I just wondered if you could say something about that too. But Fran, could you have perhaps a go at some the issues that Elaine raises first? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick, and also thank you to Ryan and Kate for very useful comments. Can everybody hear me all right? Because I appear to be freezing a bit on the screen. Okay. I just wanted to come back quickly on another couple of comments from our speakers, if that's okay. I mean, one, and I don't want to sound too defensive, but we did do a blog, Ryan, about universal credit and the pandemic, because of course, you're absolutely right to say that it had a good pandemic. And that was very much emphasized by lots of people, including the government, but it was a different animal. It had an uplift, but not only that, but conditionality was suspended, some of the deductions were suspended. There were lots of things that were different about universal credit in the pandemic. So whilst you're absolutely right, that was one thing. And the other thing is that the particular thing that was emphasized by the government was automation. Well, you could have automated other systems. It just happened that they automated universal credit when they introduced it. But I mean, the automation is something that could happen to other systems, although I think the government would argue that automating one system together is easier than separate ones. We did also do, talking about researching universal credit through COVID rather than about COVID, we did do a separate report on the universal credit uplift as well. And we also took part in COVID Realities, which was the report that has just been released this week, but it was basically a collection of 14 different research projects researching through COVID the realities of low-income people's lives, and we swapped quite a lot of insights and lessons about that. So just to say those things. But passported benefits, I so completely agree with Elaine Kempson, who of course we've all learnt a huge amount from in terms of her writings and research. Passported benefits was something which was not thought through in terms of how universal credit would affect that. And what eventually happened in my reading of the situation is that when the DWP realized that they couldn't sort it out, they then said it was other departments' responsibilities. So free school meals, for example, was the responsibility of the Department for Education, and so on and so on. So no, it hasn't been sorted out. There are various different solutions now. Some of them actually talk about a particular income level, and therefore with the fluctuations that we've talked about in terms of people's earnings, people can go in and out of entitlement. So I think I'm right in saying that we had one person, for example, who said, you know, I've got to hang on and wait till something happens before I can actually have free glasses, I think it was. So anyway, passported benefits, I completely agree, has not been sorted out. Free school meals has got another kind of solution, which is a particular earnings threshold, which is not monthly. So it's a bit of a mess, to be honest. And of course, the other thing that could have happened was council tax benefit brought into universal credit and passported, and they decided not to do that. And so council tax benefit is actually kept outside universal credit rather than being passported. But because it's been left to local authorities to do different rules for council tax reduction, as it's usually called now, or council tax support, that also means that because sometimes those are in banded income groups, that what happens to universal credit and earnings can therefore take people out of help with council tax entirely, in a kind of jump that may mean a bigger taper rate than universal credit would impose.
Yeah, that's a really important point, Fran. Thank you very much. Marsha, can I ask you to address some of the childcare points? And there's a specific question from Sharon Wright about what was the highest proportion of men who were doing unpaid care rather than paid work during the study as well. I don't know if you're able to touch on that, but yeah, plenty of questions on childcare. Marsha. Just your mute, Marsha. Yeah.
Yeah, from our research, it was really clear just how the childcare costs, reclaiming those for universal credit, was just very complicated and just completely inadequate, really, for families. So yeah, I think just families much preferred the government-funded free childcare. But it was also clear that has its own issues and problems, and that it's families often having to pay top-ups, so it wasn't fully free, and for low-income families that could be quite significant. And there's wider issues, I think, as well, with just how we need to think about and view childcare. Some of the families had children with quite you know, disabilities or, you know, complicated behaviours, and who really didn't settle well in nursery. So, you know, they found that, you know, nursery provision, you know, just wasn't really right for their children. So I think there's a kind of wider issue that needs to be thought about, you know, in families when they do need to, you know, care for their children at home, and how they're supported to do that. So yeah, I think a bit more wider discussion about the tax-free childcare. I think that could be a simpler system. I didn't really. I don't know if any of the rest of the team have more views on that, but yeah, that, you know, that is one of the options. And other people have talked about things like things going on in Northern Ireland about better support for the upfront costs of, you know, childcare, which is a barrier in universal credit, and things like that. So yeah, there are some things which could be done which might make it better in the current system. And on the numbers, with the men doing more of the childcare at home, I thought that was really interesting. Yeah, and that kind of struck me. I think that's something that happened with more of the people that Rita interviewed, actually. But just reading back over some of the, you know, cases and everything, I think it is interesting and a change. And yeah, I think it's something which probably could do with more research into looking at how that's playing out in terms of relationships and families.
Great, thank you very much, Marsha. Rita, can I turn to you now? Just there were some questions on self-employment, as I mentioned, from Ruth at CPAG and D. Lynch. Perhaps if we could pick up on that.
Yes, self-employment. I mean, we didn't have huge numbers of people who were self-employed, but those who did have earnings from self-employment, again, just the burden of having to upload evidence of income and expenditure every month. and the kind of scrutiny as well of those claims. So this is a manual process. Often the submissions were scrutinized by work coach, so they weren't automatically accepted. And again, it was kind of added stress and administrative requirements for claimants. The other issue was just the kind of lack of expertise among work coaches in terms of advising people about becoming self-employed, the impact of the minimum income floor, what that would mean for people, and so on. So people who had been self-employed during our research, a lot of them again gave up on it and took up jobs or just ceased altogether. So I don't think it's been at all thought through how self-employed people actually engage with the universal credit system of monthly assessment and what's involved.
Thank you, Rita. There's a very specific question from Marilyn Howard, which is about one of the findings from the one earner couple seems to be that people switch between the lead carer and the impact of one partner's earnings reducing the UC of the other. How was the single UC payment affected by this, as claimants are encouraged to nominate the main carer's account? I.e., did the nominated account change when partners switched roles? So I suppose there's the question of the implications on the single parent of switching between the main carer and the main single.
Yeah, there's very little change in which account received the universal credit payment between phases 1 and 2, and there were very few joint accounts. So generally speaking, it was the same bank account, that regardless of whether the parents switched lead carer roles or not. And it did tend to be women more than men that were the recipients of universal credit. So it tended to be their income that fluctuated as the universal credit payment went up and down, irrespective, as I say, of what else was going on.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then just a couple, I mean, just from Jeff Wood, this relationship between the labour market and UC, that in many ways UC designed to support kind of, the UK's very flexible labour market, real-time assessment, all those sorts of issues. And I suppose what Jeff is saying is here, you've got the sort of insecurities in universal credit sort of magnifying or amplifying insecurity in the labour market, rather than being designed to sort of integrate effectively to support families through what is, by certainly in comparative terms, a labour market that has a lot more flexibility than, say, more stable employment patterns that you get in other, particularly European countries. I just wonder whether that's, whether you might say something about that, Rita, the sort of how well universal credit works to sort of dampen some of the labour market insecurity or to amplify it.
Yes, it was interesting that people who tended to like universal credit best and could make it work for them tended to be those who had the most stable earnings. So this is why often, like, single earner couples where the earnings of the earner were actually the same from one month to the next, tended to work best. It gave people security. The recipient of universal credit got the same amount, generally speaking, most months. And those type of jobs tend to be slightly better jobs, salaried jobs, and the very kind of work that, as you say, Nick, that universal credit is meant to kind of help people adjust to. So 0-hour contracts, irregular hours, that was where people struggled the most, because you've got two sets of changing income. So you've got wages that are changing, and then you've also got universal credit changing, and like hugely dynamic system that's really hard to predict. And of course, people only know a week before they get paid how much they're going to get in universal credit. So that it might be the same with wages. They don't necessarily know, if they're on 0-hour contracts, how many hours they're going to be working. So definitely the system was amplifying rather than helping to ameliorate that system. So working kind of counter to how universal credit was meant to work, certainly.
Thank you, Rita. Well, we've got about 5 minutes left, so I just want to allow people to jump in with any final comments. I can see Jane. There's just one question from Rochelle, which I think we haven't answered, which is, do you think Black Lives Matter visualizing institutional failures influence people's understanding of universal credit, i.e. giving them a language to express universal credit service gap? So the impact of Black Lives Matter last year on people's ability to sort of to identify and express service gaps in UC, particularly presumably related to race and ethnicity. But if anybody can pick that question up just in the final sort of round of things. Jane, I'll start with you if I may.
Yes, thanks very much, Nick. I wasn't going to pick up on that because I was following on from the previous comment about the volatilities in the labour market and universal credit. And that, I think, is the big policy trade-off in a means-tested system. How responsive should you be, and how do you balance that against the need for security? And over what time period is it appropriate to do that? And as we move, as we've built this mass means-tested system, that is really fundamental to thinking about the design. This, what time period and how responsive and how secure, as well as issues of adequacy, of course. And it kind of picks up on Kate's last point about time periods. And actually, I thought when she said it, it was almost like a great prompt for us, because we've got a follow-on study, Kate, that we're going to be carrying on. We've got some funding from Aberdeen Financial Fairness Trust to do a more detailed and more granulated time period study. So we're going to still be following people on universal credit. Indeed, some of our people who've been involved in this study will be involved in the next one. And we're going to try and collect money on information on their changes week by week, fortnight by fortnight, month by month. So we're going to get that much more detailed. And we hope David will be working with us on that as well. So Rita's going to be taking the lead on that, and Marsha. And just while I'm talking, I'd add to Kate, you also started, Nick, you said it about the sensitivity of the interviewers, and I think that was really, really we benefited so much from having the skills of Rita and Marsha in this project. And I think it also comes through in the account. So this is an encouragement for people to read our report, because it has these case study accounts in them, which are very, very telling, which give a really strong picture of people's lives and what happens to them as they're trying to navigate these changes. And again, it's written really sensitively, drawing on the case studies that Rita and Marsha put together. So and that's a plug for everyone to read, to look for our new study and to read the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. We do just have a few minutes, so perhaps if anybody has got a particular point they haven't raised or would like to come back in on any of the discussion, just raise your hand. Yeah, Ryan.
Yeah, so and thank you for the answers and the clarification about your research, Fran and Jane. That's very useful. The question on self-employment I found quite interesting, and we've done some work around self-employed people in low-income households. And despite the low income, most people prefer to be self-employed than employees because of the flexibility and freedom that's given. The model of the minimum income floor is obviously that it lasts for 12 months, and then the assumption is your business will then grow, that you don't need that cushion. I think that's a flawed assumption by the DWP around people who are self-employed on low income. I don't think it's that they're building this business that's going to grow into something huge over time, and actually their income is often volatile over long periods of time. So that's why we've said beyond that 12-month holiday where the minimum income floor does not apply, so therefore if your income is low you get your full entitlement to benefits, that there should be at the discretion of work coaches where there are months where your income might drop. Often that's a seasonal thing because of the sector that you're working in, that the minimum income floor may be for another 12 months, but at any point in time, whilst you're self-employed, you can drop that minimum income floor requirement. The government has kind of introduced a version of that during the pandemic. So beyond the 12 months, work coaches can at their discretion offer the minimum income floor suspension for many more months. I think that should be continued more generally, considering what we know about self-employed people on low incomes, that it's not that they're growing this business that's going to be sustainable and profitable. I mean, some of them will, but most of them, it's not like that, and it's volatile for long periods of time. So that would be my response on the self-employment thing.
Great, thank you, Ryan. And that obviously raises very interesting questions about minimum incomes and basic incomes guarantees of secure and stable income as well. So, you know, and it seems to me there are a lot of further questions there on kind of labour market questions and their relationship to social security that can be explored. Jane mentioned we've got a new study that we're undertaking, so we're very pleased about that. That will kick off shortly. But I just want to finish the session today. We're coming up now to 12:30 by firstly thanking Ryan and Kate in particular for responding to the report. We really welcome your contributions and many thanks for taking part today. To thank Jane as well for being the principal investigator leading this work over the last few years. It's been incredibly important for us. And then, of course, to say thank you, Rita, Marcia and Fran in particular for your presentations and for the research. I would just encourage everybody to go to the IPR site to download the report. As Jane was saying, it's a very rich report with lots of material and the evidence is very rich. And just as Rita today was present giving evidence to the Social Security Select Committee, we do hope that this evidence can be used by policymakers, by MPs, by the charitable sector, by others who are scrutinising, debating, seeking to reform public policy in this area, because it's an incredibly rich and important data set or set of research findings to inform that kind of discussion and debate. So thank you very much indeed, everybody. Thank you for participating. Please do stay in touch with IPR's work. If you followed us today, do come online to our site, get our newsletter, all those sorts of things. Follow us on social media and we'll stay in touch with you accordingly. So thanks very much indeed, everybody. Thanks to our participants. Thanks for watching. Thank you.